What do an Irish rebel, his grandson, and Britain's most famous secret agent have in common? A well-travelled man of action, good-looking and self-assured. A cunning linguist, living in a salubrious part of town with a penchant for fast cars, and immortalised by one of the 20th century's greatest literary figures. It is, of course, Micheál Joseph O'Rahilly, Michael Joseph O'Rahilly, or as he called himself, the O'Rahilly. You were expecting someone else? You might be thinking that surely the link between an Irish historical figure and James Bond is tenuous at best. And you'd be right. Stay with us though, the story actually has a very surprising and direct link to Bond. Just as the O'Rahilly was a thorn in the side of the British military in 1916, a descendant of his would throw James Bond's future into deep uncertainty over 50 years later. Born on April 22, 1875 in County Kerry, Micheál O'Rahilly was a language enthusiast and a member of the Gaelic League, which promoted Irish language and culture domestically and globally. He was also an Irish Republican and founding member of the Irish Volunteers. He spent over a decade living in Europe and America, where he found cars to be plentiful and was determined to purchase one on his return to Ireland. He and his family returned to Dublin, where, being relatively wealthy, he bought a house near Herbert Park in Ballsbridge. He also purchased a green four-seater de Dion Bouton motor car, one of the first to have a V8 engine. Driving this around Dublin in 1910 was practically the same as driving an Aston Martin DB5 around London in the swinging 60s. Stylish, flash and fast. It of course predated Bond's 1930 4.5-litre blower Bentley with the Amherst Villiers supercharger, or the R-Type Continental he drove in Thunderball. It did, however, have a comparable wow factor, and O'Rahilly almost certainly carried a high-powered revolver in the glove compartment, as Bond did. There the similarities with Bond end though. Michael wasn't an especially expert driver and infamously crashed his car into the Chapelizod Gate of the Phoenix Park. He also spent the next 6 years using his car to transport various nationalist rebels as well as smuggle arms and ammunition throughout Ireland. O'Rahilly supported militant action against British rule, but he, along with other Irish volunteers, was not in favour of an unprovoked unilateral attack. Hence the Irish Republican Brotherhood, or IRB, went to great lengths to prevent plans of the 1916 Easter Rising getting into the hands of the O'Rahilly and other volunteers. O'Rahilly eventually found out that an insurrection was planned, however, and instructed his own forces not to mobilise, since he believed it could only lead to defeat. When he saw it was about to begin, however, he joined in. He drove his car into Dublin city centre, stating, "I've helped to wind up the clock, I might as well hear it strike." 4 days after the uprising began, the GPO was in flames. O'Rahilly had led a group of men trying to find an escape route. A British machine gun at the intersection of Great Britain Street, now Parnell Street, and Moore Street, fired on the group, hitting nearly all of them. Badly wounded, O'Rahilly ducked into Sackville Lane, now O'Rahilly Parade, where, after writing a farewell note to his wife, he died of his wounds many hours later, aged just 41. So far, no connection to Bond. The O'Rahilly left behind a wife and 6 children, one of whom, Egan, from the Irish Éadagáin, was born in 1904. Éadagáin grew up to be a successful businessman and also had a son, Éadagáin Ronan O'Rahilly. Tall, good-looking, expelled from school at the cutting edge of the 1960s cultural revolution, and we're still not talking about Bond. Ronan O'Rahilly, grandson of the O'Rahilly, moved to London aged 17. There he began hanging out in nightclubs where he soon became acquainted with music industry figures. He was literally in with the in crowd. He ran a club called The Scene where the Rolling Stones played, and he managed musicians such as Georgie Fame. Alan Price of The Animals said of Ronan, he was very hip and really fancied himself, but he had a lot of get up and go. While young Ronan was on the front lines of the 1960s pop culture revolution, the BBC had a monopoly on radio broadcasting, and pop music was not yet the national pastime of Great Britain, to borrow a phrase. Those hungry for their next hit of this revolutionary music relied on Radio Luxembourg, which had a powerful transmitter reaching all over Europe, albeit with the signal fading in and out as it stretched to its very limits. Even then, Radio Luxembourg was controlled by a small number of record companies, so it was very difficult to hear new and exciting acts. The entrepreneuring young O'Rahilly decided to fill that void.
Well, I suppose in a way it came out of the 60s rock and roll era, because at the time I was managing a number of bands, and there was a very big block against independent record companies. There was only EMI and Decca at the time. And a particular artist I had was Georgie Fame. And Georgie had this problem that at that time, that he was very much rhythm and bluesy, jazz, black orientated, you know, were his roots. And of course, at that time, it was Cliff Richard and the Shadows and Frank Ifield, and that was the establishment.
He raised over £150,000, or £1 million in today's money, and fitted an old passenger ferry, the MV Frederica, with studios, a transmitter, and a 13-ton, 165-foot broadcasting mast. He parked the boat off the coast of Essex, which was technically in international waters, and created his own pirate radio station. O'Rahilly decided to call the station after his girlfriend, Caroline, daughter of the Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, Reginald Maudling. The station opened with the Rolling Stones' Not Fade Away, and soon captured the zeitgeist. It became a musical and cultural phenomenon, with other pirates soon following, and ultimately leading to the BBC launching Radio 1 in 1967, Britain's first pop music station. The story of Radio Caroline was the subject of a number of books and a film, The Boat That Rocked, starring Bill Nighy and Philip Seymour Hoffman. O'Rahilly then ventured into film, producing two in 1968 with Marianne Faithfull and John Lennon and Yoko Ono respectively. He and Phil Solomon, another Irishman from Belfast, formed Major Minor Records, which released early recordings from them, Van Morrison's band, Rory Gallagher and the Dubliners. They also released Serge Gainsbourg and Jane Birkin's Je T'aime, whose orgasmic backdrop caused a sensation at the time. All this helped O'Rahilly build quite the reputation for himself. One commentator noted that he was the quickest, cleverest, and best connected of a new breed of radio buccaneers. He was known, amongst other things, for riding his motorcycle down the King's Road in Chelsea, a familiar part of town to Bond fans, and his reputation was not lost on one George Lazenby. Lazenby took acting lessons for his role as Bond from a friend of O'Rahilly's, Kevin Duggan. As detailed in Some Kind of Hero by Matthew Field and A.J. Chowdhury, O'Rahilly would later manage Lazenby and ultimately become his Svengali. He wasn't into money, he was into the way people thought about things. This would prove disastrous for George Lazenby, and also troublesome for Bond. Under O'Rahilly's influence, Lazenby chose to ignore his agent Maggie Abbott's repeated attempts to get him to sign a contract for the follow-up to On Her Majesty's Secret Service. This caused tension with the producers, which played into O'Rahilly's hands. He enjoyed upsetting the establishment, as he saw it, and he advised Lazenby that Bond was over and that he should be looking towards youth culture instead. The producers did their best to get Lazenby to commit to a deal, with Harry Saltzman offering £1 million, according to Lazenby, to get him back. The influence of O'Rahilly was too much, though. Lazenby resisted. He grew his hair and a beard. He decided that the James Bond craze was over. He donated his clothes from the Bond film to the Salvation Army, and all labels specially made for George Lazenby for On Her Majesty's Secret Service. Instead of returning as James Bond in Diamonds Are Forever, Lazenby left the franchise but stuck with his mentor, appearing in the O'Rahilly-produced Universal Soldier in 1970, which he described as anti-guns and anti-Bond, a comedy with no plot. He went on, "There was a script, but we didn't follow it. We were all smoking wacky tobacco." The film flopped despite some good critical notices for Lazenby's acting. O'Rahilly went on to briefly manage American rock band MC5. He also promoted spiritual guru and hippie philosopher Ram Dass heavily on Radio Caroline. He formed a band which released an album, Loving Awareness. Most of the band's members went on to form Ian Drury's Blockheads. O'Rahilly married in 1993 and in 2007 was inducted as a Fellow of the Radio Academy at the Lyrath Hotel in Kilkenny. He was diagnosed with dementia in 2012 and died in a nursing home in Carlingford on April 20th, 2020. George Lazenby paid tribute. It's kind of bittersweet to hear Ronan O'Rahilly has passed away. He was the man behind Radio Caroline, the pirate radio station which helped kick off the swinging 60s in London. I remember those days well. He was very influential on me, giving up the role of James Bond back in 1969. While I was shooting On Her Majesty's Secret Service, Ronan convinced me Bond was all over. Why get tied to one image when I could do a range of roles? I guess he appealed to the times. He convinced me not to stay on as Bond. I'd be in danger of becoming a part of the establishment, something he rebelled against. Easy Rider was supposed to be the way forward, and I could do 3 or 4 of those types of movies for every Bond. I wanted to be a free spirit, make love, not war. Ronan didn't let me sign the Bond contracts, kept sending it back. He was executive producer on my movie Universal Soldier. Who knows what would have happened had Ronan not got a hold of my brain. But I don't regret a day of my life, not a single day, and I still have a great life. Rest well, Ronan. Visitors to Dublin can see the lane where the O'Rahilly lay wounded and died, now named after him. It is marked by a plaque with the note he wrote to his wife as he lay dying. Sadly, the house where he lived was demolished by myopic and history-averse developers with fingers in the greasy till, to quote Yeats. And speaking of W.B. Yeats, in 1938 the poet defended O'Rahilly's use of the definite article before his name, something he'd taken directly from Gaelic culture similar to Robert the Bruce in Scotland. Sing of the O'Rahilly, do not deny his right. Sing a the before his name, allow that he, despite all those learned historians, established it for good. He wrote about that word himself, he christened himself with blood. How goes the weather?